Welcome to History Gone Mad. You're dressed for a wedding, but your bride is already cold. Her lips are sewn shut, her hands folded. Her name spoken one last time. The priest asks if you'll take her as your lawfully wedded wife. And you say yes, because in this world, love isn't always between the living. This is the story of the law that forced the grieving to marry corpses, to sign marriage certificates for dead fiancés, to hold ceremonies beside coffins. This isn't fiction. This is the part of the past they buried, quietly. Beneath a wedding veil, let's begin. Asterisk. The wedding nobody wanted to attend. You stand in cold stone chapel in rural France. 1347. The air smells of incense, something else, something rotting. Before you lies a corpse dressed in wedding attire, and beside it, a trembling young woman in white. This isn't a funeral. This is a wedding ceremony. And you're about to witness something that will haunt your dreams forever. The priest opens his prayer book with shaking hands. The bride, Marie de Montpellier, age 16, stares at the decomposing face of her groom, a man who died 3 weeks ago from the plague. His skin has turned gray-green, and his eyes have sunken deep into his skull. The wedding ring slides easily onto his skeletal finger. This isn't madness. This is the law. A law so twisted that it defied every natural instinct. It governed the lives of thousands across medieval Europe. You watch as Marie whispers her vows to a corpse, her voice breaking with each word. The dead man's family nods approvingly from the pews, counting the dowry money they'll receive. But how did humanity reach this point? How did a civilization that built magnificent cathedrals and composed haunting music also create a legal system that forced the living to marry the dead? The answer lies in a web of plague, politics, and desperate attempts to preserve something more valuable than life itself, property. In the 14th century, as the Black Death swept across Europe like a scythe through wheat, entire bloodlines were being extinguished overnight. Noble families watched their carefully arranged marriages crumble as their sons and daughters died before they could consummate their unions. Dowries that took generations to accumulate were left in legal limbo, land that had been promised through. Marriage contracts became disputed territory. The church, desperate to maintain order and protect its own vast holdings, began issuing special dispensations. If a betrothed couple died before their wedding, the surviving partner could marry the corpse to complete the legal union. This wasn't just permitted in many regions, it became mandatory. The dead had rights, and those rights needed to be honored. Marie's situation was typical. She had been betrothed to Guillaume de Russie since childhood, part of a carefully orchestrated alliance between two powerful families. When Guillaume died of plague, Marie's family faced a catastrophic choice: forfeit the enormous dowry and lose their lands, or proceed with the marriage ceremony as planned. The law was clear: the dead could be married within 30 days of death, provided certain conditions were met. As you watch Marie kiss her dead husband's cold lips, sealing their unholy union, you begin to understand the true horror of this practice. This wasn't just about money or land. This was about a society so desperate to maintain its structures that it was willing to violate the most fundamental boundary between life and death. The ceremony concludes with the priest blessing the union. Marie is now legally married to corpse, entitled to his inheritance but bound to a husband who will never speak, never touch her, never give her children. She is simultaneously a bride and a widow, trapped in a marriage that exists only on parchment and in the twisted logic of medieval law. But this is only the beginning of our story. What you've witnessed today is just one thread in a tapestry of horror that stretched across centuries and continents. The plague that rewrote love. You're walking through the streets of Avignon, 1348, where the Pope himself has fled to escape the plague ravaging Rome. The sound of church bells rings constantly, not for celebration, but for the dead. So many. Dead that the bells never stop. As you pass a merchant's house, you hear something that makes your blood freeze. Wedding vows being spoken over a corpse. The Black Death wasn't just killing people, it was killing the very concept of normal human relationships. Before the plague, marriage was a carefully choreographed dance of negotiations, dowries, and family alliances that could take years to arrange. Young nobles were betrothed as children, their entire futures mapped out by families seeking to consolidate power and wealth. But the plague moved faster than any human institution. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the height of the pandemic, described how the dead were honored with no tears, no candles, no mourners. What he didn't mention was how the living were being forced to honor the dead through marriage ceremonies that violated every natural law. You witnessed the aftermath of one such ceremony. Isabella di Firenze, barely 17, sits in her family's palazzo counting coins with trembling hands. 3 days ago, she married the corpse of her betrothed, Marco Torelli, who had died of plague before their planned wedding. The marriage contract was worth 50,000 florins, more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Without the posthumous ceremony, both families would have been ruined. The legal precedent came from canon law, specifically the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who argued that the soul could consent to marriage even after death if the intention had been declared. While living, Pope Clement VI, desperate to maintain church authority during the chaos of the plague, issued a papal bull in 1348 that formalized these posthumous marriages. The document, Defunctum Matrimonia, became the legal foundation for one of history's most disturbing practices, but the psychological toll was devastating. Isabella tells you about the nightmares, dreams where her dead husband crawls from his grave to claim his marital rights. She's not alone across Europe. Young women were developing what physicians called cadaver hysteria, a condition where they became convinced their dead spouses were still alive, still watching, still demanding their wifely duties. The economics drove the horror. When Lucia de' Medici married her plague-dead fiancé in 1349, she inherited not just his wealth, but his debts, his enemies, and his family's expectation that she would remarry within their bloodline to keep the fortune intact. She was 17 years old, legally bound to a corpse, and already being courted by her dead husband's younger brother. The church justified these marriages as acts of spiritual devotion. The dead, they argued, existed in a state of grace and could provide guidance to their living spouses through dreams and visions. Some widows reported conversations with their deceased husbands, leading to accusations of witchcraft and necromancy. As you walk through the plague-ravaged streets, you begin to understand that you're witnessing more than a pandemic. You're seeing the moment when human civilization bent so far backward to preserve its structures that it broke fundamental taboos about death and marriage. But the plague was just the beginning. What happened next would make these posthumous ceremonies look almost rational by comparison. The room where dreams die. You're standing in the chancery office of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in Rome, 1349. The room is filled with stacks of marriage contracts written in blood-red ink, each one representing a union between the living and the dead. The cardinal's secretary, a gaunt man named Father Benedetto, explains the paperwork with the casual efficiency of someone who has processed hundreds of these unholy unions. The corpse must be presented within 30 days of death, he tells you, his quills scratching across parchment. The face must be recognizable, though we make allowances for plague damage. The living spouse must speak the vows clearly, and there must be 3 witnesses of noble blood. The bureaucracy of death marriage had become a thriving industry. Embalmers charged premium fees to preserve corpses long enough for the ceremonies. Lawyers specialized in posthumous marriage contracts. The church collected fees for special dispensations. Death had become profitable in ways that would have horrified earlier generations. You watch as Father Benedetto reviews the case of Elena Visconti, whose betrothed died of plague in Milan. The young woman had walked 300 miles to Rome, carrying her dead fiance's preserved head in a silver box. The rest of his body had been too decomposed for transport. But church law required only that the essential part of the groom be present. The head, being the seat of the soul, was considered sufficient. The psychological examination was the most disturbing part. Elena sits before a panel of 3 priests, describing her dreams of her dead beloved. He speaks to me, she whispers. He tells me he's waiting for our wedding night. The priest nods solemnly, recording her words as evidence of the deceased's continued consent to the marriage. But you notice something else in Elena's eyes, a vacant stare that you've seen in other posthumous brides. The church called it sacred melancholy, but you recognize it as something far more sinister. These young women weren't just marrying corpses. They were being systematically broken by a system that valued property over sanity. The documentation required for these marriages was extensive. Proof of the original betrothal, testimony from family members, medical evidence of the death, and most disturbingly, a detailed description of the corpse's condition. Father Benedetto shows you a form that reads, "The groom's left eye has collapsed, but the right remains sufficiently intact for recognition. The jaw has detached, but can be wired for the ceremony." The financial implications were staggering. Elena's marriage to a severed head would make her one of the wealthiest women in northern Italy. The Visconti family lands, worth over 200,000 ducats, would pass to her control, but the price was her sanity, her future, and any hope of a normal life. As you leave the chancery, you carry with you the sound of Elena's voice as she practiced her wedding vows to the head in the silver box. The priests had coached her on proper pronunciation, as if the dead could hear the difference between "I do" and "I." The system was perfect in its horror legal, profitable, and completely insane. But the worst was yet to come. The morgue keeper's daughter, you're in the basement of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. 1,350. Where the dead outnumber the living 3-1, the morgue keeper, a hollow-eyed man named Philippe Lemort, tends to rows of preserved corpses. Dressed in wedding attire, his daughter, 16-year-old Marguerite, moves between the bodies with practiced ease, adjusting their clothing and applying fresh cosmetics to their rotting faces. They must look presentable for their brides, Philippe explains, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The living ones are particular about appearances. Marguerite has spent her entire life preparing dead men for their wedding days. She knows which preservatives work best, how to wire a jaw shut so it won't fall open during the ceremony, and how to position the hands so they appear to be reaching for their living brides. Her skills are in high demand. Noble families pay handsomely for her services. But today is different. Today, Marguerite is the bride. Her betrothed, Jean de Bourbon, died of plague 6 weeks ago. The marriage contract, signed when she was 12, stipulates that the union must be completed within 2 months of death. The Bourbon family has paid Philippe's fee for embalming their son, and now they've come to collect on the marriage arrangement. You watch as Marguerite applies rouge to her own cheeks, preparing for her wedding to a corpse she's been maintaining for weeks. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The girl who made the dead beautiful for their brides is now becoming one of those brides herself. The ceremony takes place in the cathedral above. Jean's corpse, dressed in silk and velvet, is propped upright in a chair. His head lolls to one side, held in place by a metal brace hidden beneath his collar. His eyes, which Marguerite had carefully glued shut, reflect the candlelight like dark mirrors. Archbishop Guillaume de Milan performs the ceremony with obvious distress. He's conducted 47 posthumous marriages in the past year, and each one has taken a piece of his soul. The words of the marriage liturgy, which once spoke of love and hope, now sound like an incantation from hell. Marguerite speaks her vows clearly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She's promised to honor and obey a husband who will never speak, never touch her, never give her children. The marriage contract grants her access to the Bourbon estates, but it also binds her to a form of spiritual and legal slavery that will last until her death. The wedding ring slides onto Jean's finger easily. Marguerite had measured it weeks ago while preparing his body. As she kisses his cold lips, the congregation shifts uncomfortably. Even in an age accustomed to death, this moment feels like a violation of divine law. But the most disturbing part comes after the ceremony. Following tradition, Marguerite must spend her wedding night with her dead husband. She's led to a chamber where Jean's corpse has been placed in a bed. Positioned as if sleeping, she's expected to lie beside him until dawn, completing the consummation of their unholy union. As you watch her disappear into that chamber, you realize that you're witnessing the systematic destruction of a human soul, the consummation of nightmares. You're standing outside the bridal chamber in the Chateau de Bourbon, listening to the sounds that no human should ever hear. Inside, Marguerite lies next to her dead husband, whispering to his corpse as if he could respond. The wedding night tradition for posthumous marriages required the living spouse to remain with the dead until sunrise, symbolically consummating their union. The theological justification was complex and horrifying. According to church doctrine, the soul remained attached to the body for 40 days after death, hovering between the earthly and divine realms. During this time, the dead could theoretically participate in spiritual intercourse with their living spouses. The physical act wasn't necessary. The spiritual connection was considered sufficient to sanctify the marriage. But the reality was far more disturbing. Through the chamber door, you hear Marguerite's voice growing increasingly frantic. She's describing sensations, cold touches, whispered words, the feeling of being watched by empty eye sockets. The church called these experiences divine communication. Modern observers might recognize them as symptoms of severe psychological trauma. Dr. Guillaume de Chauliac, court physician to Pope Clement VI, documented 17 cases of posthumous marriage consummation in his medical treatise, Chirurgia Magna. His clinical descriptions are chilling. The living spouse often reports physical sensations during the night-cold caresses, ethereal embraces, and spectral penetration. These symptoms persist for weeks or months, leading to a condition we term cadaveric possession. The morning after reveals the full horror. Marguerite emerges from the chamber changed. Her eyes have the same vacant stare you've seen in other posthumous brides, the look of someone who has crossed a boundary between life and death and can never fully return. She speaks of her husband as if he's still alive, describing conversations they had during the night, plans he made for their future together. The legal implications were just as disturbing. Because the marriage had been consummated, even spiritually, Marguerite was now bound to her dead husband's family in perpetuity. She couldn't remarry without their permission, couldn't sell her inherited property, couldn't even leave the chateau. Without their consent, she had become a living ghost, trapped between worlds. The Bourbon family physician, Master Henry de Mondeville, prescribed a series of treatments for Marguerite's condition. These include bloodletting to purge the death humors, herbal baths to cleanse her of cadaveric essence, and daily prayers to exorcise any lingering spirits. The treatments were based on the belief that prolonged contact with the dead could corrupt the living through a form of spiritual contamination. But the most disturbing aspect was how quickly this became normalized. The servants went about their duties as if nothing unusual had happened. The chaplain performed morning prayers as if blessing a corpse in the marriage bed was routine. The family discussed business matters over breakfast while Marguerite sat silent, occasionally turning to address her dead husband as if he were participating. In the conversation, as you leave the chateau, you carry with you the knowledge that you've witnessed something that will haunt European society for generations. The line between life and death has been erased, and the consequences will ripple through history in ways that no one can yet imagine. But this practice was spreading, and what happened next would make even these horrors pale in comparison. The Plague Bride Market. You're in the marketplace of Bruges, 1351, where alongside vendors selling bread and wool, there are stalls offering services that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. A wooden sign reads, "Posthumous marriages. Arranged, discreet, and profitable. The Merchant." A shrewd woman named Beatrice van der Meer maintains a ledger of available corpses and their accompanying dowries. "Fresh death, noble blood, excellent dowry," she calls out, describing a young knight who died of plague 3 days ago. The von Habsburg family seeks a suitable bride for their deceased son, willing to negotiate terms. The casual tone makes. Your skin crawl, she's selling human corpses like livestock. The Black Death had created a grotesque economy. Families with unmarried dead members were eager to complete profitable marriage contracts, while impoverished noble families saw opportunity in marrying their daughters to wealthy corpses. The plague had democratized death, but it had also commodified it in ways that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature. You watch as Lady Catherine de Flanders examines potential dead husbands like a housewife choosing fish at market. Her family has fallen on hard times, and a posthumous marriage represents their only hope of financial salvation. She studies the ledger carefully, comparing dowries and inheritance rights with the practical efficiency of a banker. The negotiations are conducted with clinical detachment. Beatrice explains the conditions. The von Habsburg boy has been dead for 3 days. Well, within the canonical limit, the family offers 80,000 florins, 2 castles, and rights to the Rhine toll bridges. The corpse is in excellent condition. We've had him packed in salt and wrapped in linen. The face is still recognizable, though there is some discoloration, but the hidden costs are enormous. Catherine's potential mother-in-law, the Dowager Countess von Habsburg, explains the expectations. You will live in the family mausoleum for the first year. Maintaining vigil over your husband's tomb, you will speak to him daily. Reporting on household matters and seeking his counsel on the anniversary of his death, you will renew your vows before his remains. The psychological requirements were as binding as the legal ones. Posthumous widows were expected to maintain the fiction that their dead husbands were still present, still participating in family decisions. They dressed places at meals for their corpse spouses, left bedchambers unchanged, and consulted empty graves before making important decisions. The church had developed elaborate rituals around these ongoing relationships. Father Johann Eckhart, a Dominican mystic, wrote extensively about spiritual marriage with the blessed dead. His teachings suggested that posthumous spouses could achieve a form of mystical union that transcended physical death. These ideas provided theological justification for practices that bordered on necromancy. As you watch Catherine negotiate her marriage to a corpse, you begin to understand the true scope of this horror. This isn't just about individual families completing marriage contracts. It's about an entire society that has lost its way so completely that it's willing to treat death as just another business transaction. The contracts are signed with blood red ink, sealed with wax that contains actual grave dirt. Catherine will marry her corpse husband in 3 days, joining the growing ranks of women who have crossed the boundary between life and death in pursuit of financial security. But the practice was about to spread beyond Europe's borders, carrying its horror to places where death held even darker meanings. The death ships of Venice. You're standing on the docks of Venice. 1352, watching as a galley called La Sposa Mortale, the dead bride, prepares for departure. The ship's cargo hold contains 12 preserved corpses and their living brides, bound for Constantinople, where posthumous marriages have become a lucrative export business. The stench of embalming fluids mingles with salt air, and the screams of seagulls overhead. The captain, Marco Dandolo, treats his morbid cargo with the same professional care he would precious spices or silk. The bodies must be kept cool and dry, he explains, showing you the specially constructed compartments lined with salt and aromatic herbs. The living passengers require special accommodations. The brides are a mixture of Venetian nobility and desperate commoners. Some have married corpses for inheritance rights, others to escape poverty or family disgrace. They huddle together. On deck, their wedding dresses stained with sea spray and tears. Each woman clutches a small casket containing personal items that belong to their dead husbands: rings, locks of hair, final letters written before death. The most disturbing passenger is Caterina Morosini, a senator's daughter who married a plague victim and now insists on taking his corpse to the Holy Land for a proper burial. She's paid for her dead husband's body to be embalmed with the finest Egyptian techniques, wrapped in silk and placed in a cedar coffin inlaid with gold. She speaks to the corpse regularly, asking its opinion on the weather, the journey, and their future together in Jerusalem. the ship's physician, Dr. Alvise Cornero, maintains detailed records of the posthumous marriages he's witnessed. His journal, written in code to avoid church censorship, describes the psychological deterioration of the living spouses. Day 7 at sea. The widow, Elisabetta, has begun sleepwalking, attempting to climb into her husband's coffin. The widow, Francesca, claims her dead spouse visits her dreams. Providing navigation advice, the widow, Caterina, has not eaten for 3 days. Insisting she must fast until her husband's spirit gives permission. The economic implications are staggering. Venice has become the center of European posthumous marriage trade, with specialized lawyers, embalmers, and transporters, creating an entire industry around death unions. The city's tax records show that posthumous marriage contracts generated over 500,000 ducats in revenue. During 1352, alone more than the entire spice trade with Constantinople. But the most horrifying aspect is how normalized this has become. The ship's crew treats the corpses like regular passengers, adjusting their positions during rough weather, checking their preservation, and even consulting them on important decisions. The superstitious sailors believe that dead passengers provide protection from storms and pirates as the ship disappears into the Mediterranean mist. You realize that you're watching the spread of a practice that will contaminate every corner of the known world. The posthumous marriage trade has become self-perpetuating. The profits are too enormous, the legal precedents too established, and the psychological dependency too complete for society to abandon it. The dead are no longer just buried. They're being exported, imported, and traded like commodities. Death has become a business, and business is booming. But the horror is about to reach new depths as this practice encounters cultures with even stranger relationships with the dead. The corpse empress of Byzantium, you're in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. 1353. Witnessing something that defies all understanding of imperial protocol. Emperor John VI Cantacuzino stands before the altar, about to marry his dead daughter to a Venetian corpse in a ceremony that will seal a trade agreement worth 200,000 bezants. The dead bride, Princess Irene, has been dead for 6 months, but her mummified body sits upright on a throne, dressed in purple silk and crowned with pearls. The Byzantine Empire, desperate for Western gold to fund its wars against the Ottomans, has embraced posthumous marriage as a diplomatic tool. Dead imperial children are being married to deceased European nobles, creating alliances that transcend death itself. The theological justification comes from Eastern Orthodox doctrine, which maintains that the soul remains connected to the body for 40 days after death, allowing for spiritual marriages that can be legally binding. The groom, Francesco Dandolo, died of plague in Venice 3 weeks ago. His preserved corpse has been shipped across the Mediterranean in a lead-lined coffin, accompanied by Venetian diplomats who negotiate the terms of this unholy union. The marriage contract grants Venice exclusive trading rights in the Black Sea in exchange for 50,000 ducats and a pledge of military support. But you notice something disturbing about Princess Irene's corpse. Her body has been artificially preserved using techniques learned from Egyptian mummies, and her face has been painted with cosmetics to simulate life, more unsettling. Her eyes have been replaced with precious gems that gleam in the candlelight, giving her the appearance of a jeweled idol rather than a human being. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Callisto's Eye, performs the ceremony with visible reluctance. The Eastern Orthodox Church has always maintained a more mystical relationship with death than the Western Church. But this marriage pushes the boundaries of acceptable practice. The Patriarch's hands shake as he places the crowns of matrimony on the heads of the two corpses, creating a union between the truly dead and the recently deceased. The wedding guests include the living members of both imperial families, who witness this spectacle with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Byzantine court, once the most sophisticated in Europe, has been reduced to bartering dead children for gold. The empire's decline is measured not just in lost territories, but in the degradation of its most sacred rituals. The most disturbing moment comes when the emperor commands that the marriage be consummated. The two corpses are placed together in the imperial bedchamber, positioned as if embracing. Byzantine law requires that posthumous marriages be sealed through physical contact between the bodies. Ensuring that the spiritual union is complete, palace servants, trained in the dark arts of death management, arrange the corpses in poses. That's the just romantic intimacy. As you watch this macabre tableau, you begin to understand that the practice of posthumous marriage has evolved beyond mere legal necessity. It has become a form of necromantic statecraft, where the dead are conscripted to serve the political needs of the living. The boundary between life and death has been erased, not just in personal relationships, but in the very structure of international diplomacy. The Byzantine Empire is literally dying, and it's taking the sacred institution of marriage down with it. The ghost wedding of the Black Forest. You're deep in the Schwarzwald, Germany, 1354, following a procession of torches through fog so thick it seems to swallow sound itself. The wedding party moves like specters through the ancient trees, carrying a bride toward a ceremony that will violate every law of nature. The groom has been dead for 4 months, but German tribal law demands that the marriage contract be honored, even if it means wedding the living to the decomposed. The bride, Greta von Württemberg, was betrothed to Heinrich von Baden when both were children. The marriage was to unite two powerful German principalities. But Heinrich died of plague before the ceremony could be performed. Now, on the anniversary of his death, Greta must complete the union in a ritual that predates Christianity by 1,000 years. The ceremony takes place in a clearing where ancient standing stones form a circle around a massive oak tree. Heinrich's corpse, little more than bones and rotting flesh, has been propped against the tree trunk and dressed in his finest armor. The metal gleams in the torchlight, but you can see maggots crawling through the gaps in his visor. The officiant is not a priest, but a tribal shaman named Wolfram the Bone Speaker, who claims to communicate with the dead through ancient Germanic magic. He speaks in Old High German, invoking gods whose names were forgotten when Christianity arrived. The ritual combines elements of pagan death worship with twisted interpretations of Christian marriage vows. The dead hunger for completion, Wolfram intones, his voice echoing through the forest. They cannot rest until their earthly contracts are fulfilled. Heinrich calls to his bride from the shadow realm, demanding that she join him in the space. Between life and death, Greta stands before her corpse groom, her white dress ghostly in the moonlight. She's been fasting for 3 days, drinking only water infused with herbs that are said to allow communication with the dead. Her eyes have the hollow look of someone who has stared too long into the abyss. The marriage vows are unlike any Christian ceremony. Greta must promise to follow Heinrich into death within 7 years, to bear his spirit children, and to serve as his anchor in the world of living. In return, Heinrich's estate worth over 100,000 marks will pass to her control. Along with the political alliance between their families, the consummation is the most horrifying part. Greta must lie with Heinrich's corpse until dawn, allowing his spirit to possess her body. The tribal belief is that dead husbands can impregnate their living wives through spiritual intercourse, creating children who exist partly in the realm of the dead. These shadow children are considered blessed by the spirits but cursed by the church. As you watch Greta embrace her rotting husband, you witness the collision of ancient pagan beliefs with medieval Christian law. The Holy Roman Empire has been unable to stamp out these practices, and the plague has given them new life. What began as a legal loophole has become a form of death worship that threatens to consume entire regions. The ceremony ends with Wolfram sealing the marriage by mixing earth from Heinrich's grave with Greta's blood. The union is complete, but you know that what you've witnessed is not just a wedding, it's a form of spiritual suicide that will haunt the German forests for generations. The convent of corpse brides. You're walking through the corridors of the convent of Santa Mora near Florence. 1355, where 43 women live in a state of perpetual mourning for their dead husbands. This is not a traditional religious house. a repository for posthumous widows who have been deemed too dangerous or unstable to remain in normal society. The nuns here have all been married to corpses, and their proximity to death has given them an otherworldly quality that frightens even hardened clergy. The abbess, Mother Lucretia Borromeo, was one of the first posthumous brides in Italy, married to a plague victim in 1348. She spent 3 years living with his decomposing corpse before her family committed her to the convent. She moves through the halls like a wraith, her eyes fixed on something beyond the visible world. When she speaks, it's often to address her dead husband, asking his permission for routine decisions. The convent's daily routine is built around maintaining relationships with the dead. Each morning, the nuns visit the crypt where their husbands. Remains are kept in ornate sarcophagi. They speak to the corpses, bring them food offerings, and report on the events of the previous day. The conversations are one-sided, but many of the nuns claim to receive responses through dreams, visions, or mysterious sounds in the night. Sister Madalena de Pazzi, married to a corpse when she was 15, has developed what the convent physician calls cadaveric stigmata, wounds that appear on her body in places where her dead husband was injured. She claims these marks are signs of their spiritual union, proof that death cannot separate true love. The wounds never heal, weeping constantly and filling her cell with the smell of decay. The most disturbing resident is Sister Caterina de Siena, who insists that her dead husband visits her regularly for conjugal relations. She's given birth to 3 stillborn children, which she claims are the offspring of her union with the dead. The convent buries these spirit children in a special cemetery, marking their graves with symbols that predate Christianity by centuries. The church hierarchy views the convent with deep suspicion. Pope Innocent VI has received reports of necromantic practices, demon worship, and heretical teachings about the afterlife. But the women are too wealthy and too well connected to be simply executed. Their posthumous marriages have made them some of the richest individuals in Italy, and their families use their influence to protect them from ecclesiastical persecution. The financial records are staggering. The convent controls assets worth over 800,000 florins, making it one of the wealthiest religious institutions in Europe. The posthumous widows use their inherited wealth to fund construction projects, commission religious art, and support charitable causes. They've built a cathedral dedicated to Saint Death, decorated with frescoes that depict marriage ceremonies in graveyards and bedchambers filled with corpses. As you leave the convent, you carry with you the sound of 43 women singing vespers to their dead husbands. Their voices blend in harmonies that seem to come from another world, creating music that is both beautiful and terrifying. You realize that you've witnessed the birth of a new form of monasticism, one that worships death rather than life, and finds holiness in the marriage between the living and the dead, but the horror is spreading beyond Europe's borders. The Mongol death dowry. You're standing in the shadow of a felt yurt on the Endless. Mongolian steps in 1241, watching a ceremony that defies everything you thought you knew about marriage. The bride is beautiful, dressed in silk and silver, her face painted with ceremonial rouge. The groom lies motionless beside her because he's been dead for 3 months. This is Minghun, the Mongol practice of ghost marriage. And you're witnessing something that will haunt the Chinese Empire. For centuries, the dead warrior, Batbayar, was killed in Gidi Khan's campaign against the Jin dynasty. His parents saved every piece of silver they owned to purchase this bride, not for him, but for his corpse. The girl, barely 16, was sold by her desperate family during a harsh winter when their herds froze. The shaman chants in ancient Mongolian, binding their souls across the veil of death. You watch as the living girl places her hand on the cold flesh of her dead husband's arm. According to Mongol belief, Batbayar's spirit was lonely and restless in the afterlife, threatening to bring misfortune to his clan. Only through this marriage could his soul find peace and his family find protection from his ghostly wrath. The ceremony concludes with the girl being buried alive alongside her husband's body. Her screams echo across the steppes as dirt covers the wooden burial chamber. The Mongols believe she will serve him in the spirit world, bearing him children among the ancestors. This isn't murder in their eyes. It's duty, love, and cosmic necessity rolled into one horrifying tradition. What makes this even more disturbing is that the Mongols are about to conquer half the known world, carrying this practice with them into every territory they claim. In 1279, when Kublai Khan completes the conquest of China, Minghan becomes embedded in Chinese culture like a spiritual infection. The practice spreads through trade routes, military campaigns, and cultural exchange, taking root in soil that was already fertile with ancestor worship. The economic implications are staggering. Families bankrupt themselves, purchasing brides for their dead sons. Creating a grotesque market in human flesh, gravediggers become wealthy middlemen, exhuming recently buried young women to sell to grieving families. The practice becomes so common that the Ming Dynasty will eventually pass laws, specifically prohibiting the sale of corpses for marriage purposes. But there's something even more sinister at work here. The Mongols aren't just spreading a death cult, they're responding to a fundamental human terror that transcends culture and time. The fear that death separates us from those we love. The grave is cold and lonely, that spirits of the departed suffer without companionship. This fear is so powerful that it drives people to commit atrocities in the name of love. You leave the burial site as the sun sets over the steps, but you can't shake the image of that young girl's face. Her name was Oyuna, and she was the first of thousands who would be sacrificed on the altar of ghostly loneliness. The Mongols have just created a tradition that will span continents and centuries, justified by love but powered by terror. But what happens when this practice reaches the sophisticated courts of imperial China, where Confucian scholars will try to rationalize? The irrational? The mandate of heaven meets the grave. You're kneeling in the Forbidden City in 1368, watching Emperor Hongwu struggle with a problem that threatens the very foundation of Chinese civilization. The Mongols have been expelled, but they're ghostly. Marriage customs have taken root so deeply in Chinese soil that even the imperial court cannot uproot them. The new Ming dynasty faces a crisis. How do you govern a people who believe the dead can destroy the living? The emperor's own advisors are divided. Confucian scholars argue that Minghan violates the natural order marriage should create life, not celebrate death. But the common people whisper of terrible consequences for families who leave their dead. Sons unmarried. In the village of Yangzhou, the Chen family's crops have failed for 3 consecutive years after their son died unwed. In Guangzhou, the Wu family's remaining children have all fallen ill with mysterious fevers since their eldest. Son was buried alone. You witness the emperor's dilemma firsthand as he sits in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Scrolls of conflicting reports spread before him. The Mandarin Zhang Yeishan presents evidence that ghost marriages are bankrupting rural communities. Desperate. Families are selling their living daughters to buy dead brides for their sons. Creating a grotesque economy of corpses, graveyards are being plundered nightly, and young women are being murdered specifically to supply the ghost marriage market. But then the court astronomer, Liu Bowen, approaches the Dragon Throne with troubling news. The Imperial Observatory has recorded unusual celestial phenomena in provinces where ghost marriages have been banned. Comets appear over regions where local magistrates have tried to stop the practice. Floods destroy villages where families have been forced to bury their sons alone. The cosmos itself seems to be rejecting any attempt to separate the living from the dead. The Emperor's solution is as brilliant as it is disturbing. Rather than ban ghost marriages outright, he codifies them into imperial law, the regulations. Concerning posthumous unions of 1374, establishes official procedures for ghost marriages, complete with government-appointed matchmakers who specialize in pairing the dead. The law requires that all ghost brides must die of natural causes. No. Murder is permitted, but it also mandates that wealthy families must provide ghost marriages for their deceased sons, making it not just a cultural practice, but a legal obligation. You watch as the imperial bureaucracy adapts to accommodate the dead. Special courts are established to handle disputes over ghost marriages. Government officials are trained to mediate between the living and the dead. The Ministry of Rites creates elaborate protocols for ghost weddings, complete with prescribed rituals and state-sanctioned prayers. China becomes the first civilization in history to officially recognize marriage between the living and the dead as a legitimate form of union. The consequences are immediate and horrifying. Within a decade, the ghost marriage industry becomes one of the most profitable sectors of the Chinese economy. Professional ghost matchmakers earn more than silk merchants. Families begin planning their children's posthumous marriages while they're still alive, creating detailed contracts for future ghost unions. The practice spreads beyond China's borders, following trade routes into Korea, Vietnam, and eventually Japan. But what happens when the state itself becomes complicit in these marriages of the dead? When the emperor's own family faces the terrible choice between love and law? The emperor's dead daughter. You're standing in the shadows of the imperial palace in 1398, watching Emperor Hongwu face the ultimate test of his own law. Princess Anning, his beloved daughter, has died of fever at age 19, just 3 days before her wedding to the Duke of Wei's son. The empire holds its breath as the most powerful man in China must decide whether to subject his own child to the ghost marriage laws he created. The princess lies in state in the Hall of Celestial Favor, her wedding dress now serving as her burial. Shroud. The Duke of Wei's son, Prince Mingshan, kneels beside her bier, very much alive but bound by imperial decree to marry a corpse. The political implications are staggering. This union will cement the alliance between two of China's most powerful families, but only if the emperor is willing to sacrifice his daughter's soul for the stability of the realm. You witness the emperor's private agony as he prays before the princess's body. According to the court historian's secret records, Hongwu speaks to his dead daughter's spirit, asking for her forgiveness. He explains that the ghost marriage laws were created to prevent chaos, to give structure to humanity's desperate need, to connect with the dead, but now those same laws demand that she be married to a man she barely knew, condemned to serve him in the afterlife regardless of her own desires. The wedding ceremony takes place at midnight in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Prince Mingshan, dressed in funeral white, recites his vows to Princess Anning's corpse. The emperor personally performs the rites, his hand shaking as he places the jade marriage bracelet on his daughter's cold wrist. The princess's body is then sealed in a tomb alongside gifts for her new husband, silk robes, precious jade, and a collection of love poems she will never read. But the real horror begins after the ceremony, according to the ghost marriage laws. Prince Mingshan is now widowed and cannot remarry for 3 years of mourning. He must perform daily rituals at the princess's tomb, burning incense and presenting offerings to his dead wife. The Duke of Wei's family line hangs in limbo, waiting for a widow who will never bear children to release her husband from his ghostly obligations. The emperor's decision creates a precedent that will haunt the Chinese nobility for generations. If the Son of Heaven himself will subject his own daughter to ghost marriage, then no family in the empire can claim exemption. The practice becomes not just culturally accepted, but politically necessary. Noble families begin negotiating ghost marriage contracts as carefully as they arrange living unions, treating death as simply another form of diplomacy. Within months, the imperial court is flooded with requests from noble families seeking ghost marriages for their deceased children. The emperor has unwittingly created a system where death becomes a tool of political alliance. Young nobles begin to see ghost marriage as a form of insurance, even if they die. Their families can still benefit from strategic posthumous unions. The princess's tomb becomes a pilgrimage site for parents planning their children's ghost marriages. They come seeking the emperor's blessing for their own macabre unions, believing that Princess Anning's spirit will guide their negotiations with the dead. But what happens when the common people realize that even the emperor's daughter is subject to these laws? When death becomes the great equalizer in a rigidly hierarchical society. The gravedigger's fortune. You're crouched in a moonlit cemetery outside Beijing in 1402, watching Chen Xiaoming become the wealthiest man in the province by selling corpses to desperate families. The gravedigger's shovel strikes another pine coffin, and you realize you're witnessing the birth of China's most macabre industry. Chun has discovered that young women who died unmarried are worth more than their weight in silver to families. Seeking ghost brides for their dead sons, the economics are horrifyingly simple. A recently deceased young woman can be sold for 50 taels of silver, more than most families earn in 3 years. Chun has developed a network of informants throughout the city. Coroners who tip him off to fresh deaths, mourners who whisper about beautiful corpses, even Buddhist monks who break their vows to profit from the afterlife, the ghost marriage. Market has created incentives that corrupt every level of society. You watch Chun examine the body of Liu Mifeng, a 16-year-old girl who died of consumption just yesterday. He checks her teeth, her skin, her hair, evaluating her marriage potential as if she were livestock. The Chen family has already approached him about purchasing a ghost bride for their son who died in a farming accident. They're willing to pay 80 taels if the girl is particularly beautiful, because they believe attractive ghost brides will give their dead sons higher status in the afterlife. The gravedigger's ledger reads like a merchant's inventory. Young woman, died in childbirth, intact features, 60 taels. Elderly woman, died peacefully. Suitable for elderly ghost groom, 20 taels. Child, died of fever. For ghost child marriage, 30 taels. Chun has categorized the dead like commodities, creating a price structure based on beauty, age, and social status. The more desirable the corpse, the higher the price. But Chun's success breeds competition. Other gravediggers begin raiding cemeteries, leading to violent territorial disputes over the dead. The government responds by licensing official ghost marriage brokers who must register with the Ministry of Rights. These brokers establish formal relationships with families, creating contracts that specify exactly what kind of corpse they're purchasing and for what purpose. The industry becomes so sophisticated that specialized roles emerge: ghost matchmakers. Evaluate the compatibility between dead brides and grooms. Corpse beauticians prepare bodies for their posthumous weddings, using cosmetics and preservation techniques to make the dead appear more lifelike. Spiritual mediators claim to communicate with the dead to ensure their consent to the marriage arrangements. You follow Chan as he delivers Liu Mifeng's body to the Wang family compound. The transaction is conducted with the same formality at a living marriage negotiation. The Wang family examines the corpse, negotiates the price, and even demands guarantees about the girl's virtue and family background. They're not just buying a body, they're purchasing a daughter-in-law who will serve their dear Chen for eternity. The ceremony takes place 3 days later. Wang Jianhong, who died of plague 6 months ago, is exhumed and placed beside his new ghost bride. The family performs elaborate rituals to introduce the couple's spirits. Complete with wedding feast offerings and ceremonial gifts, Chun collects his payment and disappears into the night, already planning his next grave robbery. But what happens when the supply of naturally deceased young women can't meet the demand for ghost brides? When the market for the dead begins to consume the living? The bride murders of Shaanxi. You're hiding in the shadows of a courtyard in Taiyuan in 1434, watching the Li family poison their own daughter to sell her as a ghost bride. 17-year-old Li Shulan doesn't know that the tea her mother serves her contains mercury from broken mirrors, carefully measured to kill slowly enough that her death appears natural. The ghost marriage market has created such demand for fresh corpses that families are murdering their own children to escape poverty. The Li family owes 200 taels and gambling debts to the local magistrate. Li Shulan's death will solve their financial crisis in one horrible transaction. The Wang family has already agreed to pay 150 taels for a suitable ghost bride for their son, who died falling from a horse. The remaining 50 taels will come from selling their daughter's possessions and claiming a traditional mourning payment from the clan association. You watch Li Shulam's final hours as the mercury slowly destroys her organs. She complains of stomach pain, then fever, then delirium. Her parents comfort her tenderly, speaking of how proud they are of her sacrifice for the family. In her final moments, she whispers that she's happy to help them never knowing that their tears are not from grief, but from guilt and relief. The murder is perfectly executed. The village doctor, who has been paid to ask no questions, certifies that Li Shulin died of sudden illness. The coroner, who receives a percentage of every ghost marriage sale, records her death as natural. Causes. The local magistrate, who desperately needs the Li family's debt payment, expedites the paperwork. Everyone in the system profits from this young woman's death. But the Li family's crime is not unique. Across Shaanxi province, families are discovering that their daughters are worth more dead than alive. The provincial records from 1434 show a dramatic spike in deaths among unmarried young women, particularly in families with outstanding debts. The ghost marriage market has created a systematic incentive for femicide disguised as natural tragedy. You follow the Li family as they negotiate with the Wang family for their daughter's corpse. The haggling is brutal. The Wangs want to examine the body to ensure it's suitable for their son's status. They check Li Shulan's teeth, her skin, her hair, treating her like a prized animal. The final price is negotiated based on her beauty, her family's reputation, and the perceived quality of her spirit. The ghost wedding ceremony is held in the Wang family ancestral hall. Li Shulan's body, dressed in red silk and adorned with jade jewelry, is placed beside the exhumed corpse of Wang Chenghao. The Taoist priest performs the binding ritual, calling on the spirits to recognize this union. The families exchange gifts and toasts, celebrating the alliance between their dead children. But the celebration is interrupted by a disturbing discovery. Wang Chenghao's body has begun to decompose unusually rapidly, and strange marks appear on his skin. The priest declares that the ghost groom is rejecting his purchased bride, sensing that her death was not natural. The supernatural world, it seems, can detect murder even when the mortal world cannot. The wedding becomes a nightmare as both families realize they've been cursed by their own greed. But the real horror is still to come when the government discovers that the ghost marriage market has become a cover for systematic murder. The Inquisition of the Dead. You're standing in the imperial tribunal in Beijing in 1448, watching Judge Wang Shiren conduct the first criminal investigation into ghost marriage murders. The courtroom is packed with accused families, corpse brokers, and government officials who all profited from the systematic killing of young women. The Ming Dynasty has finally awakened to the monster it created. But the investigation reveals corruption so deep that it threatens to topple the entire system. Judge Wang has spent 3 years gathering evidence of the ghost marriage murder conspiracy. His investigators have documented 847 suspicious deaths of unmarried young women across 5 provinces. The pattern is always the same: families and financial distress, daughters who die suddenly of mysterious illnesses, and immediate sales of their corpses to wealthy families seeking ghost brides. The investigation has uncovered an entire economy built on the bodies of murdered girls. You watch as the first witness testifies, Chen Xiaoming, the gravedigger who became wealthy selling corpses, breaks down under interrogation. He admits to paying families to kill their daughters, providing poison and instruction on how to make. Murders appear natural. His confession reveals a network of corrupt officials, unethical doctors, and desperate families who transformed ghost marriage from a spiritual practice into a systematic murder industry. The testimony is horrifying, Doctor. Li Shuming confesses to providing mercury, arsenic, and other poisons to families, teaching them precise dosages that would kill slowly enough to avoid suspicion. Magistrate Zhou Wencheng admits to falsifying death certificates in exchange for percentages of ghost marriage sales. Even Buddhist monks are implicated, having blessed murders, disguised as marriages while accepting generous donations from guilty families. But the real shock comes when Judge Wang reveals the extent of government complicity. The Ministry of Rights has been collecting taxes on ghost marriage transactions. Treating murder as a legitimate source of revenue, imperial officials have been accepting bribes to expedite ghost marriage licenses, knowingly facilitating the sale of murdered corpses. The very system created to regulate ghost marriages has become a tool for profitable genocide. You witness the trial of the Li family, accused of murdering their daughter Li Shulian. The evidence is overwhelming. Mercury residue in her teacup. Witness testimony about the family's debts. And the suspicious timing of her death just days before the ghost marriage sale. But the family's defense reveals the true horror of their situation. They were not evil, they were desperate victims of a system that made their daughter's death more valuable than her life. The trial exposes the fundamental contradiction in Chinese ghost marriage law. The imperial government created legal frameworks that incentivized murder while simultaneously claiming to protect the dead. The law required wealthy families to provide ghost marriages for their sons, creating demand at licensed brokers to supply corpses. Legitimizing the trade, they taxed the transactions. Profiting from the death, the state had become the greatest enabler of the very crimes it was now prosecuting. Judge Wang's verdict is revolutionary. He declares that ghost marriage laws are incompatible with the mandate of heaven and recommends their complete abolition. But his recommendation faces fierce resistance from families who have built their fortunes on the dead. Officials who profit from the system and common people who genuinely believe that unmarried ghosts will haunt their families forever. The trial becomes a battle between reason and superstition, between justice and tradition. But what happens when the emperor himself must choose between preserving an ancient custom and stopping a systematic genocide? The Emperor's Dilemma. You're witnessing history in the Forbidden City. In 1449, as Emperor Zhengtong faces the most difficult decision of his reign, Judge Wang's investigation has proven that ghost marriage laws are facilitating systematic murder. But abolishing them could trigger supernatural panic across the empire. The emperor must choose between protecting the living and appeasing the dead, between justice and cosmic harmony. The imperial council is divided. The Confucian scholars, led by Grand Secretary Yang Shiki, argue that ghost marriages violate the natural order and must be banned immediately. They present evidence that the practice has corrupted Chinese society. At every level, turning families into murderers and officials into accomplices. The death toll from ghost marriage murders now exceeds 3,000 documented cases, with thousands more suspected. But the Taoist priests, led by Celestial Master Zhang Yuqiu, warn of catastrophic consequences if ghost marriages are abolished. They cite ancient texts claiming that unmarried spirits become vengeful demons who can destroy entire dynasties. The priests present their own evidence: failed harvests in regions where ghost marriages have been banned, plague outbreaks in cities where the practice has been restricted, and astronomical phenomena that suggest cosmic displeasure. You watch the emperor struggle with reports from across the empire. In Guangdong province, Governor Li Mingshan reports that banning ghost marriages has led to increased suicide rates among parents who believe their unmarried dead children are suffering in the afterlife. In Sichuan, military commanders report that soldiers are deserting, rather than risk death without the promise of posthumous marriage. The supernatural fear runs so deep that rational governance seems impossible. The emperor's own family experiences the dilemma personally. His nephew, Prince Jingtai, died unmarried in a hunting accident. And the imperial family is under tremendous pressure to arrange a ghost marriage. The court astrologers warn that failing to marry the prince's spirit could bring misfortune to the entire dynasty. But arranging the marriage would make the emperor complicit in the very system he's considering abolishing. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. A group of Buddhist nuns, led by Abbess Li Kungzhao, proposes a revolutionary solution: spiritual marriage ceremonies that don't require actual corpses. They argue that ghost marriages were always about spiritual union, not physical bodies. The souls of the dead can be married through ritual and prayer without the need for corpse trading or murder. You witnessed the first experimental spiritual marriage ceremony in the palace. Prince Jingtai's spirit is married to the spirit of a young woman who died naturally, with both families participating in the ritual, despite the bride's body being buried hundreds of miles away. The ceremony maintains the spiritual and social functions of ghost marriage while eliminating the economic incentives for murder. The emperor's decision is as pragmatic as it is revolutionary. Rather than banning ghost marriages outright, he transforms them into purely spiritual ceremonies. The new law prohibits any physical handling of corpses for marriage purposes, but allows families to arrange spiritual unions through prayer and ritual. The ghost marriage industry collapses overnight, while the spiritual needs of fearful families are still addressed. But the transition is not without consequences. Thousands of families who invested their fortunes in the ghost marriage trade are bankrupted. Officials who profited from the system face prosecution. And across the empire, people wonder whether the spirits of the dead will accept these spiritual marriages or demand revenge for the disruption of ancient customs. The spiritual revolution. You're standing in the Temple of Heavenly Peace in 1452, watching the first generation of children born after the ghost marriage reform come of age. These young people have grown up in a world where death no longer equals profit, where their unmarried siblings won't be murdered for their corpses, where spiritual needs are met through prayer rather than grave robbery. The transformation of Chinese society is profound, but the old fears die hard. The spiritual marriage. Ceremonies have evolved into elaborate rituals that satisfy both religious needs and social expectations. Master Chen Wudao, the head priest at the temple, has developed standardized procedures for marrying the spirits of the dead. Families can arrange these ceremonies for a fraction of the cost of traditional ghost marriages, and no one has to die for the ritual to be complete. You witness one of these ceremonies as the Wu family marries their dead son's spirit to the spirit of a young woman who died of natural causes 3 provinces away. The families never meet in person, but their representatives participate in a shared ritual that binds their children's souls across the spiritual realm. The ceremony includes traditional elements tea service, gift exchange, ancestral prayers, but eliminates the grotesque commerce in corpses. The economic impact is dramatic. The ghost marriage industry, which once employed thousands of people in grave robbing, corpse trading, and murder, has vanished completely. Former corpse brokers have become spiritual counselors, helping families navigate the emotional complexities of posthumous loss. The savings from not purchasing actual corpses has freed up enormous amounts of capital for productive investment, but the social changes run deeper than economics. Young women no longer live in fear that their families might murder them for ghost marriage money. Parents no longer face the terrible choice between financial survival and their children's lives. The systematic devaluation of female life that ghost marriage created has begun to reverse, leading to the first improvements in women's social status in centuries. You follow Master Chen as he trains a new generation of spiritual marriage priests. These young clerics are developing increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks for connecting with the dead without exploiting the living. They argue that true spiritual marriage requires the consent of both souls, something that was impossible when one party was murdered for the transaction. The resistance to these changes comes from unexpected quarters. Some families genuinely miss the tangible connection they felt when their dead children were physically married to corpses. They argue that spiritual marriages feel less real than traditional ghost marriages, but the absence of physical bodies makes the union incomplete. A few wealthy families continue to practice traditional ghost marriages in secret, maintaining underground networks of corpse traders and corrupt officials. The government responds with increasing sophistication. Imperial investigators have developed new techniques for detecting secret ghost marriages, including forensic examination of recently disturbed graves, and financial audits of families who claim their wealth comes from legitimate sources. The penalties for participating in corpse trading have been increased to include exile and property confiscation. But the most significant change is cultural. The generation growing up after the ghost marriage reform thinks differently about death, marriage, and the relationship between the living and the dead. They're more willing to let the dead rest in peace, more focused on honoring ancestors through memory rather than manipulation. What happens when these reformed attitudes encounter the ancient traditions of China's neighbors? When the ghost marriage controversy spreads beyond the Middle Kingdom. The ripple effect. You're standing at the border between China and Korea in 1467, watching the ghost marriage controversy spread like wildfire across East Asia. The Chinese reforms have created a spiritual and political crisis that threatens to destabilize the entire region. Korean nobles who have practiced ghost marriage for generations are now questioning whether their ancestors were demons or saints, while Japanese samurai families debate whether their honored dead have been properly served. The Korean royal court in Seoul is in chaos. King Seo has received detailed reports about the Chinese ghost marriage murders and the subsequent spiritual reforms. Korean families have been practicing their own version of ghost marriage, called spirit wedding, for over 200 years. The revelation that the Chinese version led to systematic murder has prompted a painful examination of Korean practices. You witnessed the Korean court's investigation into their own ghost marriage traditions. Scholar Kim Jong-seo presents evidence that Korean spirit weddings, while not involving murder, have created similar problems. Families have been bankrupting themselves to purchase elaborate ceremonies for their dead children. Young women have been sold into spiritual slavery, bound to serve dead husbands they never knew. The practice has created a class of spiritual widows who can never remarry because they're already bound to ghosts. The Japanese response is even more dramatic. The Ashikaga shogunate has banned all contact with Chinese ghost marriage refugees, fearing that the practice might contaminate Japanese spiritual traditions. But the ban has created a black market in ghost marriage services, with Japanese families secretly traveling to China to arrange posthumous unions for their dead samurai sons. The practice has become associated with both forbidden knowledge and ultimate devotion. You follow a delegation of Vietnamese scholars as they travel to Beijing to study the Chinese ghost marriage reforms. Vietnam has its own traditions of ancestor marriage, and the Vietnamese court wants to understand how to maintain spiritual harmony while avoiding the murderous excesses of the Chinese system. The delegation meets with Master Chen Wudao and other spiritual reform leaders, learning techniques for spiritual marriage that don't require corpses. The cultural exchange becomes increasingly complex. Buddhist monks from Tibet arrive in China to debate whether ghost marriages are compatible with Buddhist teachings about death and rebirth. Islamic scholars from Central Asia argue that the entire concept of posthumous marriage violates the natural order established by Allah. Christian missionaries, newly arrived from Europe, declare ghost marriages to be demonic practices that must be eliminated completely. The debate reaches the imperial court of the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Mehmed II receives reports about Chinese ghost marriage practices from his ambassadors. The Ottoman response is swift and absolute. Any Ottoman subject caught participating in ghost marriage will be executed for apostasy. The practice becomes a defining difference between Islamic and Confucian civilizations, adding religious conflict to the cultural controversy. But the most significant development comes from an unexpected source: European merchants and missionaries. Returning from China bring stories of ghost marriage to European courts. The practice captures the imagination of European nobles, who begin experimenting with their own versions of posthumous marriage. The controversy that began in the Mongol steppes now threatens to spread across the entire known world. The ancient practice of marrying the dead has become a global phenomenon, challenging every civilization it touches to examine their own beliefs about death, marriage, and the relationship between the living and the departed. The eternal legacy. You're standing in a modern cemetery in rural China in 2023, watching an elderly woman perform a ritual that would be recognizable to a Mongol warrior from 800 years ago. Mrs. Chen is conducting a spiritual marriage ceremony for her deceased grandson, adapting ancient practices to modern sensibilities. The ghost marriage tradition has survived empire, revolution, and modernization, proving that humanity's need to connect with the dead transcends politics and progress. The ceremony is beautiful in its simplicity. Mrs. Chen burns incense and paper money, speaks to her grandson's spirit. and formally introduces him to the spirit of a young woman who died in the same village. There are no corpses, no financial transactions, no exploitation. Just an elderly woman trying to ensure that her grandson isn't lonely in the afterlife. The murderous commerce of the Ming Dynasty has been replaced by genuine spiritual comfort. But the legacy of those darker times still echoes through modern China. The ghost marriage murders of the 5th-10th century created legal precedents that influenced Chinese family law for centuries. The tension between individual rights and family obligations, between protecting the living and honoring the dead, continues. To shape Chinese society today, the ancient question of whether the dead have rights that supersede the rights of the living remains unresolved. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the true scope of the ghost marriage phenomenon. Excavations in Shaanxi province have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of young women who died suspiciously during the peak of the ghost marriage trade. DNA analysis confirms that many of these women were murdered, their bodies sold too. Families desperate to provide companionship for their dead sons. The archaeological evidence provides scientific confirmation of the historical records, proving that the ghost marriage industry was even more extensive than previously known. The practice has evolved in fascinating ways. Modern Chinese families still arrange spiritual marriages for their deceased children, but the ceremonies now emphasize consent and spiritual compatibility rather than financial transaction. Online platforms have emerged where families can connect to arrange spiritual marriages, creating digital communities around ancient traditions. The internet has become the new Silk Road for ghost marriage, connecting grieving families across vast distances. Psychologists studying the phenomenon have identified ghost marriage as a response to fundamental human needs that transcend culture and time. The fear of death, the desire for continuity beyond the grave, the need to feel that departed loved ones are not suffering. These emotions are universal. Ghost marriage represents humanity's attempt to solve the ultimate problem: how to maintain relationships with people who no longer exist. The practice has also influenced Western funeral traditions in unexpected ways. Modern grief counseling incorporates elements of spiritual communication that echo ancient ghost marriage rituals. Virtual reality technology is being used to create digital afterlife experiences that allow families to visit with their deceased loved ones. The same human needs that drove Mongol warriors to bury living brides with dead husbands now drive Silicon Valley entrepreneurs to create digital immortality. As you watch Mrs. Chen complete her ceremony, you realize that the story of ghost marriage is really the story of human love confronting the inevitability of death. The practice evolved from brutal exploitation to genuine spiritual comfort, proving that even humanity's darkest traditions can be transformed by compassion and wisdom. The dead may not need our marriages, but perhaps we need to believe they do. In the end, ghost marriage reveals more about the living than the dead, our desperate desire to love beyond the grave, to connection that transcends mortality, to hope that death is not the end of the story. The incense burns away. The prayers fade into silence, but the ancient human need to love the dead continues forever.